Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass.
Hello and welcome to Shining Moon Episode 33, Food and Foodways in Fiction. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. With me today are Beth Cato, Pierre Cornell, Amelia Gorman, Nibedita Sen, and D.A. Xiaolin Spires. Let's get started with some introductions. Nebula Award-nominated Beth Cato is the author of 1,000 Recipes for Revenge and A Feast for Starving Stone from 47 North plus two fantasy series from Harper Voyager. She's a Hanford, California native now moored in the Driftless area, which is just an amazingly poetic thing to say out loud. That is beautiful. She usually has one or two cats in close orbit. Follow her at bethcato.com and on Twitter at BethCato. Hi, Beth. Welcome to the podcast. It's nice to have you back.
Hi, Deborah. Thanks for having me.
P.A. Cornell is an award-winning Chilean-Canadian author who has published over 30 original pieces of short fiction in magazines like Lightspeed, Apex, and Fantasy. Her work has also appeared in over 20 anthologies, including Year's Best Canadian Fantasy and Science Fiction, which also listed her novella Lost Cargo, which we discussed last week, as one of the best of 2022. For more on the author and her work, visit pacornell.com. Welcome back, Patty!
Good to be back.
Amelia Gorman lives in Eureka, where she spends her free time exploring tide pools and redwoods with her dogs and foster dogs. Her fiction has appeared in Night Script 6 and Cellar Door from Dark Peninsula Press. You can read some of her poetry in Vestarian, Utopia Science Fiction, and Strange Horizons. Her first chapbook, The Elgin-winning Field Guide to Invasive Species of Minnesota, which I can't recommend enough, is available from Interstellar Flight Press. Her microchapbook, The Worm Sonnets, is available from the Quarter Press. Welcome back to the podcast, Amelia.
Hey, it's fun to be here.
Nibedita Sen is a Hugo, a Nebula, and Ignyte Award-nominated queer Bengali writer from Calcutta and a graduate of Clarion West 2015, whose work has appeared or is forthcoming in Uncanny, Podcastle, Nightmare, and Fireside. She accumulated a number of English degrees in India before deciding she wanted another in creative writing and that she was going to move halfway across the world for it. These days, she can be found working as an editor while consuming large amounts of coffee and video games. She lives in New York City with her boo and their sweet, flatulent old cat, enjoys the company of puns and potatoes, and is nearly always hungry. Welcome, Nibedita. It is nice to meet you.
Hello all, happy to be here.
D.A. Xiaolin Spires steps into portals, reappearing in Hawaii, New York, various parts of Asia, and elsewhere with her keyboard appendage attached. Her work appears in Clarkesworld, Analog, Nature, Strange Horizons, Uncanny, and elsewhere. In her alter ego realm, she's conducted advanced-level NSF-funded research in anthropology, specializing in food, agriculture, and technology and the social meanings entailed in production and consumption. She enjoys advertently committing food crimes and writing speculative gastronomic misadventures and about robots in space. Welcome to the podcast. It's nice to have you here.
Hi, Deborah and everyone. Have you eaten yet? That's a Chinese.
I have, fortunately, before starting this podcast, because I knew I was going to be hungry if I didn't by the end of this podcast, because all of you are phenomenal writers. And again, as I was reading things, it was like, I better have something to eat. All right, I'm going to start at the top with, and I'm going to do this in alphabetical order. Why do you make food a central part of your fiction? I'm going to start with Beth, because so many of your stories revolve around food in some way or another. Why make it a central part of your fiction?
Food is good.
Yes, it is.
That's really what it comes down to. It's one of my favorite things about being alive. And it brings me great joy. And it's also a very complicated thing because I have fought eating disorders in the past, and that threat is always looming over me. So it's that sense where it's a blessing and a curse. And I think fiction especially is a fantastic realm for exploring those issues.
It is, yes. That was going to be one of my later questions because I know about about your previous battles with food disorders. Matter of fact, I seem to recall that I was one of the few people who reached out to you after reading a poem. I was like, "Are you okay?" And you said, You're the only person who's reached out. Yes, I'm fine.
Yes,
Thank you for asking."
and I'm prepared to talk about that one more later too.
Good. I'm glad to hear about that because I really liked the poem. It was deeply moving, and if you want to talk about it, I am totally open to hearing more about it.
Okay.
PA, Patty, how about you? Why do you bring food into your fiction?
I mean, like Beth, I'm also a foodie, so I just love like just reading about fiction as a reader, the descriptions and everything, and I just feel like it just comes naturally to use that. It's also like a
Hmm.
great tool to convey information about your character. Like you can say a lot about like their culture, social class,
Hmm.
whatever, through food. For instance, take Hannibal Lecter
Oh God, yes.
if you think about not just the fact that he's a cannibal, but the way he prepares his protein of choice tells you so
Yes,
much
yes.
about that character. So just for things like that, and it can
It's
also
not just a food obsession with him, it's a fetish. He fetishizes the
right.
food. And yes,
Exactly. Makes them
yeah,
all the more disturbing, right? So,
yes.
yeah, and not just character, like also it can, have quite a bit of bearing on like, plot points. For instance, I was always like just fascinated in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when Edmund betrays his family basically for a piece of Turkish delight. Like, how great is this candy? I need to know. So things like that. And of course setting.
Generations of American children have tried it and gone,
God, no,
"Mm,
it's not so great.
not seeing why he would betray for this." No.
Right. So, and also just with things like setting, which I actually used in one of my stories from last year, Once Upon a Time at the Oakmont, which is set in a building that kind of straddles time periods. So,
Mhm.
in that one, I used like the characters have a monthly potluck, and the foods kind of, you know, are representative of the eras that they all come from and stuff. So just with things like that, like food can just be such a great tool to, put
Yes,
the reader in that story.
yes. I love these answers. Amelia, why do you use food in your stories?
Um, Again, it's like it is, well, it's a part of everyone's life, but I love community meals. I love cooking with friends. I love cooking for friends. And then also at the same time, I used to work as a baker, so it's something I have some like insider knowledge in that makes it fun to write about. And also something that was deeply terrible for me. It was a situation where like management was terrible,
Hmm.
and being a woman working all alone at night when other people who worked in the same facility could come in led to a lot of terrible harassment. And
Yeah.
it's something that I think is, coming through in a lot of the things I write is also this frustration with food and this frustration with food culture, restaurant culture,
Yeah, understand.
institutional kitchen culture.
Yeah. Nibedita, why do you write about food?
Several reasons. I mean, to start, I'm from a culture that deeply values food, has a very rich cultural tradition of food, and food is key to how you show love in my culture. But also,
Oh, me
food
too.
is just fascinating in that it intersects with every aspect of identity. Like the acronym, I like to use a SCAGER, CAGER, where it's class, ability or disability, gender, ethnicity, and religion. And food is affected by and intersecting with every single one of these. As Amelia said, food can be very complicated. It's not always joyful. It can be a source of great
Mhm.
pain and deprivation and struggle, and that just makes it so rich as a avenue to explore in fiction and to build out characters and worlds. Yeah.
Okay, I love the answers. DA, how about you?
Yeah, I think I'm echoing a lot here, but I think about food a lot and eat possibly a lot, and also quite diverse foods. And I hold a PhD in anthropology, and my research involves food systems, agriculture, technology, society, et cetera. And I've conducted lots of interviews with professionals, a lot of them living in Asia and around the world, who make food, eat food, distribute food, appreciate food, and practice food practices. So the anthropological answer for me is that food constitutes our bodies, and people use food as a touchstone to their identity, as many of you already said, like Nibedita just said. And you literally let food pass through the porous borders of your body to bring it into yourself. So it's outside and it comes in. And everyone eats. So it's relatable, it's sustenance, it's nourishment, it's connecting, but it's highly personal, and it's a huge industry, as Amelia said. And food also has started wars, and people have gone off exploring for spices. And it's also a concern when you don't have all the richness of the earth around us. And how do we procure food in the starkness of space? So it's a nice sort of plot device as well. And food is longing, it's appetite, it's temptation, and it's satisfaction. It's culturally specific and universal. So I can't stay away from it, and it makes me hungry.
Beautiful answer. Love it. So much to talk about here. I personally am with Nibedita in a lot of ways here, because for me, food is love. When I love someone, I want to feed them, I want to cook for them, I want to please them in any way that I can, through the palate, through their eyes, through the presentation, everything along those lines. And unfortunately for me, I have a husband who believes that food is fuel.
I have a husband who's allergic to garlic and onions.
Oh no, that's almost impossible. Oh.
I cook for friends a lot.
All right, so going on to our next question, does including food in your fiction tend to make your writing more cozy or less so? Because some of you deliberately subvert the coziness of food, the community of food, the connections of food. And Amelia was particularly one of those with her story that we will be talking about later in this podcast. And I asked this question specifically because we've had several episodes about cozy fiction and the fiction of hope punk, solar punk, things like that. Do you find that food is a cozy element or not a cozy element? And I'm going to bring that back to Beth.
It really depends on what the story needs. In my new novels out now that begin with 1,000 Recipes for Revenge, obviously from the title, it's about food, and it's about food magic. And from the beginning, you think, they harvest, these ingredients, these creatures, this flora and fauna, and use it to create magic. And as the book develops, it begins cozy, it ends up not so cozy. There's
very much not cozy.
There's a much darker side to it that is revealed through the course of both books. And I think, to me, that's realistic because, like, I was saying before, and like the others have said, it's, food is a blessing and a curse. It is love, but it can also be hate.
Yes,
and
it can.
I think all of that plays into the complicated nature of food. The thing that can sustain us can also destroy us.
Indeed. And that relates back into our not really the solar punk, but into some of the more dystopian futures where we're talking about systemic breakdown of agriculture in the future. We're talking about the systemic breakdown of the environment in the future, and how subsistence foods become more and more important, that sort of thing. Patty, how about you? Cozy or less so?
Yeah, I agree with Beth in that it really depends on the story. It can also be like food scarcity, for instance, not so cozy, or going back to the cannibal example, maybe not so cozy there either, but it depends on how you approach it, but you can really use it anyway. I mean, it's a tool like any other tool in writing.
Great.
So like, I feel for me personally, because I love food, I tend to like use it in a more cozy way in my own fiction, even though my stories aren't always so cozy in themselves, but there might be like a scene in there or something. Just to give an example, I had a story come out last year called 440 Broad Street, Apartment 4C, and it takes place during an alien invasion where these neighbors get together basically to wait out the end of the world, and they don't even know each other very well, but they come together because they need to eat while they're waiting, and they make this like stew concoction out of a bunch of different stews the one guy has. And they share a packet of Oreos and stuff, and then they find common ground through that. So I mean, when you use it in that sort of way, like it can have, like, that's deliberately a scene to kind of show some peace in this chaotic situation they're living in. But yeah, it's just for that one scene. Like, you need a break sometimes from the craziness, and that can give you that. But it can work in many ways.
It can, yeah. I'm going to shift questions here a little bit for Amelia, because this is tailored a question specifically for you. Do you ever forage for wild foods, and how does that come into play in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, probably you wouldn't ask that if you didn't know the answer is yes. So I'm definitely interested in wild foods. I'm actually especially interested in eating invasive species, which I think is a great, if not great way to be ecologically helpful. It's a great way to like get people educated or excited about invasive eradication. But in my writing, I think, and like definitely this comes into play in the poem we'll talk about later, is often like people have this very romanticized idea of what an apocalypse might look like. And I cover this in Field Guide to Invasive Species of Minnesota too, my book. Is everyone has this sort of cool vision of themselves being this great survivalist, and I think myself included, like, it's so easy to fall into that kind of fantasy. So I think a lot of my work touches on that it's not pretty, and it's not sexy, and it's not romantic.
Yeah. I will say that I had to do survival training in school when I was living in Reno, and we never actually got into the foods because the idea was we were going to keep you alive long enough for rescue to get to you, because we are so dependent on the structures of modern life that it's not even worth training sixth graders to try to find food in the wilderness. It's get yourself water, get yourself shelter, get yourself out of the wind, get yourself out of the sun if you're in the desert, that sort of thing. Worry about those survival essentials and stay in one place long enough for us to find you. Not ever was it, let's try to find food.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Interesting. We're going to skip to a different question now, which is, what food traditions do you personally come from, and how do they influence how you write about food? And that's a shoe-in for me to talk to Nibedita first, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah,
Talk to me about Bengali food.
Yeah, so I'm from India, more specifically from Kolkata, which means I'm Bengali, and we have a really rich food tradition. A lot of rice, a lot of fish, because we're just off the Bay of Bengal. A lot of fairly labor-intensive, time-consuming foods, because again, food preparation being super gendered in my culture, like they are in many cultures. So that was definitely something I struggled with, especially when I moved to the USA, was realizing that the traditional foods that my mother and grandmother had made for me growing up were time consuming and labor intensive and required a lot of ingredients that I couldn't always procure easily, and often just did not have the time or the patience to go through all the steps of making that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and that influenced your writing clearly, and the two stories that we're going to be talking about today. I'm really looking forward to that, not least because I want to ask you about all the recipes. They sound so good.
Yeah, the banyan tree story in particular was written when I was at grad school in Southern Illinois, this little college town where I was the only non-white person in the English department, and I was craving Bengali food so hard. So that whole story is just a love letter to all the food from back home that I was missing.
Oh. Unfortunately, even for people who grew up in the US, it's impossible to go back in time and recapture the tastes of our youth, because my dad's cooking, I can never recapture it because he had a very specific way of cooking. He also used a lot more salt than I do. And when I came back from grad school and I tasted his food again, it didn't taste the same as it had when I was a kid, because I had learned to cook for myself. And I was like, but I want to capture that taste that he always brought to it, but I'll never taste it that way again because I'm a different person and he's gone. So yeah. DA, how about you? You talked about how diverse your food tastes are and how you explore all the different cuisines. What is your personal food tradition, and how does it influence how you've written about food?
Yeah, sure. I actually did want to respond to something you said about, your dad's cooking and trying to like get that taste back. And when I was
Yeah.
in undergrad, I wrote a BA thesis surrounding food and economics. And I coined the term because I thought it was so cool at that time, coining um, imagine commensality, where commensality is when you eat together, but then imagine
Mhm,
commensality is like going back and having this nostalgia of these romantic
mhm.
ways where you eat together. So it
Yeah.
reminds me of like, well, a lot of like space stories or stories where you're alienated or someone
Mhm.
passes away or something really tragic happens, and you have these like moments where you think of like times where you ate with other people. It's very bittersweet. But in terms of food traditions, I guess that's a good segue. In terms of food traditions, I mean, I grew up eating a mixed bag of Asian and American foods. I guess some people would say American includes Asian and other ethnic, quote unquote, ethnic foods. And I've lived in many places like New York, Hawaii, Spain, Japan. So I picked up traditions from each place. And it's so hard to tell, like, when people talk about traditions, they're like, oh, is it authentic or not authentic? But like, I think one of the things about traditions is that they're invented and they change. And that's what's so
Yes.
interesting about migration and that those kinds of um, movements. And so any cosmopolitan city will have like numerous cuisines to partake in. So I'm
Yes.
influenced by access to these meals. And I love holiday foods from like osechi ryori to nyangao to Thanksgiving cranberry sauce to apple pies and poke and I just also like very basic like pizza, noodles, that kind of stuff. But I'm also quite irreverent when it comes to food, and I talked about the food crimes, possibly that would appall other people. Like I tend to eat things like matzo and tuna fish with like ketchup on it, and just or seaweed with microwave frozen vegetables and like katsuobushi. Like just take things here and there in my pantry and just like throw them together. Oh, I've done jam on hot dogs, which was very, very disturbing to people I live with. So um yeah. And I have a really soft spot for Ethiopian injera, and I
Mhm.
stuff like sliced turkey and fried eggs on it. So I
Ooh,
think food practices like transform depending on what you have access to and what's around you, and what people eat.
absolutely.
Yeah, and what people eat in private is actually pretty interesting and shocking. I wish, it would be great to like have a log of all of that. I guess that's
I,
also like, is your food cozy or icky? I think there's like ickiness as a way of being cozy.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the things I delight in living in a large metropolitan area like Houston is just how much fusion cuisine happens. And there is no question of is it authentic, because it's somebody's grandma who married somebody else's grandpa. And they just happen to have made fusion cuisine together, and it's beautiful. I mean, there's a new place that's opening around the corner from me that's going to be Korean Mexican, and I'm like, I don't know what that's going to taste like, but I want to go taste it now. Please finish opening soon as possible because I want to know. Um, Patty, you're come from a Chilean-Canadian background. What is your food tradition like?
Yeah, I mean, well, like it's weird being Chilean because Chile is such a long country. Every region has
Mhm.
kind of different foods that are influenced by different things. Like for instance, northern Chile has some influence from China. Southern Chile has
Mhm.
influence from like Germany, things like that. So you get a mixed bag, and then there's also the native cuisines that go into that. So Chilean
Yes.
food is kind of already like a melting pot of foods. And then growing up in Canada, of course, I was exposed to things here. And my parents were always very good about, eating the foods of the world. the city I grew up in had a multicultural festival, and like through the foods, it was kind of my first introduction to other cultures, people other than who I knew in my immediate sphere. So, I mean, I come from all that. And, of course, it goes into my food. I even wrote a story that, incorporates Chilean food specifically, and it's about like immigration, and it's based on my own family's immigration experience. So I use food in that to kind of, for a dual purpose, really. It ties them to the home they left behind, but it also highlights how different their new home is from, what they're used to and stuff. So it can kind of do both. And just through talking with my mom about this too, because my parents and I are all first generation immigrants. My kids are not, obviously, they were born in Canada. So we were talking, I was like, how do you pass on culture really? Like, how do you deliberately pass on culture? And she said something really smart, I thought, which I've repeated a couple times, not in interviews, but just in conversation, but which was about how over time, it's almost inevitable for culture to be diluted. And you lose things like language is usually the first to go. And certain traditions will kind of, fall by the wayside. But she says food often stays for multiple generations because it's just the recipe books that, get passed down or whatever. And through that, it can have like a connection to your culture. And I think that's something that I've kind of tried to put into my stories too. And I'm not unique in that sense. I feel like there's a lot of Chilean writers that write about food because food's just a big part of like all our traditions. Probably the best known being Pablo Neruda with his multiple odes to various like onions, artichokes, tomatoes, and I could go on forever because obviously he was a foodie too. But so I guess I come by it honestly is what I'm saying.
Well, I love that. My mom is German, and you can probably hear it in my voice, if nothing else, because people always ask me, "Where are you from?" And I go, "Reno, Nevada," and they go, "No." Um, but I lost the language almost immediately because she wanted to teach me German, and she had me speaking bilingually until I was three, and then I was three, and I decided that that was going to make me too different from everybody else, and I refused to speak the language any further. And I really regret that. But the food has stayed with me because there's Westphalian ham, there's Brötchen, there's this, there's that, and that was a huge part of our cultural tradition as I was growing up. And that the food will probably stay with me, but it probably won't transmit to my son because we just don't have the same places to go to buy it here in Houston, unfortunately. But I still appreciate it. Beth, your food and foodways is going to be about cheese, isn't it?
Well, that's definitely part of it. But when it comes to my background, I'm a product of a white Protestant middle America.
Yep.
So, yeah. Born and raised in Central California. On my mom's side, well, at this point, they've been in California for about a century, but they came through the American South. My dad was born and raised in Alabama and went out to California in the 70s. So that meant I was eating tacos made from a mix.
Yeah.
And then my dad, we had trouble finding okra reliably in stores. So he grew okra, and my mom would make fried okra. He grew mustard greens so that, we could do mustard greens, cornbread. So a lot of traditional Southern American foods blended with just kind of, stereotypical American garbage foods that feed us efficiently and cheaply. And and then out of that, living in a place in California, there was a great Chinese food, Mexican food, stuff like that around. So I grew up with a lot of that as kind of our treat food. And then, like you said, Deborah, I'm now known I have this social media presence because of my love for cheese. As a kid, we were poor. So, I mean, I lived and, indulged in hefty doses of, the Kraft green can Parmesan and lots of Kraft cheese, or the Food for Less Kojak cheese that they would have, for cheap.
Yeah.
And then as I got older, then I began to explore cheese and really embrace that as part of my being.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to have your thing and to know what it is and then embrace it. So,
If I'm going to have a reputation for something, let it be cheese.
Amelia, how about your food and food ways? What sort of cultural tradition do you have coming out of your family background?
I mean, replace like South with Midwest, but then it's very similar to Beth.
Yeah.
So I mean, the not great kind of casseroles you grew up on of like Campbell's soup and some kind of starch and maybe a can of tuna. I mean, and good things too, like Friday fish fries and yeah, like growing vegetables.
No Lucas?
What?
No Lucas? Since I know you spent a lot of
Oh,
time in
Ludicrous. Oh my
Minnesota.
gosh. Are you yeah. So have I told you this? I can't remember. My
No.
mom insisted on making lutefisk once a year, every year around Christmas time. For those who don't know, lutefisk is a dried, super dried codfish. And then it is rehydrated with lye to increase its absorbency. So what you're left with is almost like gelatinous. And then you rinse the lye off because it's not safe to eat. It's like, it's originally Swedish. Pretty much no one except possibly my mom eats it in general. But she always made us have lutefisk once a year, sometime in December.
All right.
Absolutely. Um, it's not terrible. Like it has almost no taste, so you can't say it tastes bad. But the
The
texture,
textural element might be a little bit objectionable if you're not used to
yeah,
it.
yeah. I know my mom. She moved out of the Midwest a while ago, and she's very sad that she can't get lutefisk where she currently lives.
God. Well, she knows how to make it. All comes down to it. All right, let's move to your individual work at this point in the broadcast. We're going to start with Beth with the short story "The Recipe Keeper," which appeared in Flash Fiction Online. In a troubled future where aliens have taken control of human lives, food other than loaves are forbidden, and recipes are contraband, passed orally from person to person and stored in people's minds as a reminder of the lives and cultures lost in the invasion of the narrator's world. Brooke, the narrator, wants a total of 100 recipes, and she vows she'll stop collecting them once she gets that 100 recipes, until a near brush with authority leaves her more defiant than ever, and she returns to collecting and trading knowledge. What gave you the inspiration for this story? Why the specific recipes that you chose to highlight, like staples like butter and different types of cheese and things like that? Why were those the recipes that were being held onto? Talk to me about the story, please.
Well, the inspiration came down to a Flash Fiction Online was having, they put out a call, and it was like their 100th episode and or issue, and they wanted, stories around that theme. So I mulled over, and of course I came back around to the subject of food and recipes, and I read a lot of food history books about cultures, foods around the world. It's a subject of endless fascination for me because to me, food is just such an essential part of individual identity and cultural identity in history. And it's such a complicated thing that to me, and it's something that is manipulated. It is something that the conqueror uses to control in whether it's colonialism, whether that is, you're talking planetary countries on Earth. There's such a sordid history to that to me, it felt like a natural fit for a science fiction setting to use that kind of domination over food and to make the carrying over of Earth-based recipes contraband. And so they have to be told kind of an oral tradition to preserve them. And for someone who's traveling and working, and then is in a point where people learn to approach them and say, hey, I have this recipe, do you want it? That there's a intense danger to that. And to me, there's such a solid basis of history in that. It's sad and true.
Yeah, this is unfortunate that one of our guests was not able to be here today. That was Brent Lambert, and his story, which I will link in the comments anyways, because he deserves to have his stuff read. dealt a lot with imperialism and colonialism and how food got labeled differently to appeal to the conquerors who came there as tourists, that sort of thing. So yeah, it's an unfortunate part of history, but it's very real and it's unfortunately still with us in many regards. Patty, your story, How to Impress a Top Food Critic and Put Your Restaurant on the Galactic Map, appeared in Drabblecast, September 2022. The chef in the story has been sent an AI by Mr. Rothman, a food critic who wants the chef to prepare a specific dish for him. A dish that involves going to multiple planets and overcoming increasingly impossible and ludicrous tasks to acquire the ingredients for it. The chef finds themselves betrothed to two different genders of the same species and missing several fingers by the end of the story. But this was just the beginning because, as the AI tells them brightly, Mr. Rothman also wants dessert. This is a brilliantly told, brilliantly humorously piece that contains just enough of your trademark darkness, all in implication, for a contrast. What gave you the inspiration for this story? Please say it was a story, something like Iron Chef or something like that. And talk to me about the story.
Well, the initial writing of the first draft was almost accidental. I just kind of, it was a Saturday morning, and I was like, I'm just going to do some free writing and see what happens. And this is what came out. Like the first draft was essentially what was published. I didn't do too much to change it, and I don't know where that came from. But for sure, there was some influence by the Food Network. I've been watching cooking shows like my whole life, and a lot of those
Yeah.
Food Network shows like Iron Chef or Chopped or whatever.
Mhm.
I'm sure that's all in my brain forever. And yeah, and I often think about like just food critics. Like I'll be in a restaurant and I'll be like, I wonder if there's a critic in here. Like what are they ordering? What do they think of this chicken or what? So I mean, like food's on my mind a lot. So I guess that's where this came
Yeah.
from.
No, I love the story. It is I love the implication of darkness, particularly at the end where he's climbed a mountain, he's gotten to the top of Everest, and then there's another mountain past him. And at what point do you say that the sunk cost fallacy has kicked in, and you just say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore? But the implication is that he's going to continue.
Yeah, well, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not for the weak.
Have you ever worked in a commercial kitchen?
I have not, but I'm a home cook, so I do cook like
Yeah.
almost every single day, and I do obviously have an interest in food. I've read a lot of cookbooks and things about technique, and I'm familiar with food terminology and all that stuff. So
Mhm.
I've watched The Bear. So
I have not. I
yeah.
have not. It's on the list of things that I need to at some point get around to.
Oh, it's so good.
Awesome. Amelia, your story, She Makes the Deep Boil, appeared in the Sharp and Sugar Tooth anthology from Upper Rubber Boot Books. I was so afraid I wasn't going to be able to say that right, and I staggered through it anyways. In this horror story, the protagonist, the stew maker, is a woman who can make anything, no matter how foul it might be, taste edible, and she finds and salvages what she takes to be a carcass deposited by the sea on the beach, and turns it into bowl after bowl of soup for the hungry fisher folk of the town where she lives by the ocean. Her lover, the hookmaker, helps her to do so, but when the fishermen who've partaken of the feast all start to hear the song and stagger toward the sea, changing shape where they're devoured by the mother of the brood now hatching from their flesh, and are devoured also by the brood themselves, Stewmaker hatches a terrible plan. She baits a hook with her lover's own body and drags the mother monster into port where she obtains roe from it on a daily basis. No one goes hungry, but the mother's life cycle continues, and the song will never die. Woo! This one was dark. This completely subverted
was a
all
horror.
the expectations.
Yeah.
All the expectations of food is love. Nope, that's not it here. What was the inspiration for this story?
So the initial inspiration was that I love both like the word and the concept of globster. It's one of my favorite words in the whole world, and it is a kind of unidentified mass of flesh that lushes up on the beach. That is probably like the fat tissue of a whale or something, but typically it's defined by its unidentifiableness, really. And it's like, what would a story about a globster look like? And then a friend of mine has like a sort of joke he's told me of like, the way to write any horror story is like, that's not X, that's eggs. Like, that's not, this other thing, that's eggs. So applying that, like, that's not a globster, that's eggs.
All right. The relationship with food in the story is, of course, the source of the horror. Those who eat are eaten in turn. Did you want any sort of message taken away from this? Any sort of ecological subtext? Was that intentional in your mind, or was that just a happy coincidence of the fact that I read a lot of ecological stuff recently, and therefore it came out?
I think it's actually more of like a story about class, I guess.
Okay.
So there's a famous quote, and it's like, the worker deserves not only bread, but she also deserves roses. From, I believe, Rose Schneiderman. And first of all, she's underselling bread because bread is amazing. But the point of the story is kind of, this is like a absolutely brutal world with no roses. There is, these people do not have time for art. They don't have time for leisure. And how that can turn people into monsters, how that can make people depraved, kind of how people suffer in and again, like, it's not an accident that the characters don't have names, they have professions, and throughout the whole story they're sort of hemmed in by their professions. They're sort of forced into this terrible world as their professions.
Okay.
Yep.
Interesting. I like that. That's one that didn't really occur to me, but now I can't see it any other way. Nibedita, advice for your first time at the ferry market, appeared in Fireside in 2019. I will, of course, link this in the comments. A mother in the story talks to her daughter about how the fairy caught her by her pregnancy appetites before the daughter was born, and how she incurred a debt of owing her firstborn to the Fae folk, and a debt delayed by 16 years but never forgiven. She talks to her daughter about how she came from the womb craving food not of this world, forcing her mother to incur yet more debt to the Fae folk, and how she learned to cook with those foods using culinary techniques from her mother and grandmother in the old country, create flavors that the Fae folk had never tasted before. And then she talks about how she forced her daughter to learn how to bargain and debate from the moment she could speak, forced her onto the debate team, and now armed with that learning and a host of her mother's recipes, she's being sent to the ferry market to win back her freedom. If she wants to go with the Fae folk into her own future, whichever, it boils down to her choice, which I really particularly enjoyed that aspect, because it opens up so much autonomy for the daughter. And I loved the descriptions of the intricate new recipes the mother comes up with using the fairy's own foods mixed with Bengali spices, particularly cardamom, because I am a cardamom freak. Were any of these inspired by your own cooking, or were they more inspired by your family's cooking? And what was the central inspiration for this story?
This may make me a bad Bengali, but I don't like cardamom very much. It is a staple in a lot of Bengali recipes, though. Like the ones the story is absolutely inspired by biryani, among other things. My mom's biryani recipe involves pressure cooking cardamom and cinnamon bark and other things. I'm realizing that the two stories I put forward for this podcast are, on the whole, more positive, whereas the rest of my work tends to be kind of dark.
Okay.
Because particularly with food, and I think the story is like a good sort of bridging point, because it's definitely about food as love. Like, food is the vehicle this mother uses to show her daughter that she loves her the only way she can, and also give her a currency that she can use to then win her freedom, because food is not just currency, it's not just love, it's currency. And recipes in particular have historically been a source of women's wealth. That is when you don't have much else, you have your recipes. But also, food is power, food is domination. Whose appetites get catered to and whose appetites are considered devious or deviant or unnatural is a big part of what the dominant culture says. And it's not quite on the page, but there's an implication to the story that the mother in the story is a non-white person in a white country eating dominant food, who to save her daughter, finds herself going back to her non-white mother and grandmother's traditions and finding salvation in those in their heritage. Yeah, and it's just
Interesting.
leveraging
I
food as
like
power.
that. Yeah. And you were talking about how this is probably just going to echo what you were saying, but again, what Brent's stories were talking about with the imperialism of this far-flung star empire that and how everything was made and labeled and and just even the liqueurs, if it was exported, it had to have the queen's face on it, that sort of thing. Yeah, the food it can be domination. It can be a way of imprinting on people, and it's unfortunate.
There's a thing I like to say, which is that colonialism is the ultimate form of cannibalism. Because you might
Yeah.
not be literally consuming a people's flesh, but you are certainly consuming their energy, their blood, sweat, and tears, their hopes, their dreams,
Yeah.
their country's resources. So,
Yeah. All right, we're going to move down to D.A. Xiaolin. And the first story we're going to talk about is Last Wishes, which appeared in Clark's World, October 2020, which we'll link to in the comments. And this lovely novelette, Jin Ying, has a final duty to her mother's spirit to solve the intricate puzzle of her funerary urn before laying her to rest, quite illegally, on a colony world with a view of Sol and Earth. Her complicated relationship with her mother is expressed through her mother's love of puzzles and of baking pomelo-scented fortune cookies for her daughter, usually with the puzzles baked inside. Jinyin has 70 days to solve the puzzle and lay her mother to rest. She doesn't quite succeed conventionally. It's not her mother's puzzle that she solves so much as her own, layering the urn with golden threads and incised words that are her mother's cosmetic slogans in a dozen languages, making a beautiful object even more meaningful and lovely. She shares her grief with others, and they share theirs with her, and in the end, she does open the urn to find the final gift of fortune cookies waiting for her. I express a lot of my grief for my father through my work, so I understand very much where this came from. You've mentioned that the story is in loving memory of your mother. Let's talk a little bit about grief and processing it through your writing.
Yeah, fiction I think is particularly well suited to process grief because it's just so much, right? It's such an intense emotion, and one thing that's great about it is that it doesn't have to be true to life. I mean, people have asked me when I've read stories about X, like coffee or something else, like, oh, you must love this. And there's to some degree I do, and it's actually more nuanced. Like I used to drink coffee and I stopped drinking coffee, so it's like for like, 'cause it just makes me jittery. So like things like that where it's not necessarily coming from somewhere in me, but it's not necessarily reflecting my current, feeling or current approach towards the food. For Last Wishes, my mom passed away suddenly. In real life, my mom passed away suddenly, and it was very shocking. And I like deeply miss her and wish she could meet my spouse and child, which she never did. And in the story, the mother is not really much like my mom, at least the way I think of it. But I think there are probably some aspects that are reminiscent. She didn't make fortune cookies, that's one thing, but she did make other kinds of food. We had shared food experiences involving home cooked foods and like dishing out steamed rice and eating fish balls and fish and all sorts of foods, vegetables of all different kinds, and we also shared eating Whoppers at Burger King, and all things where they're not necessarily like, oh wow, this is going to provoke a tear, but they are memories. So in terms of writing as a way of processing grief, I think it's very helpful, and I don't, it's not like I intentionally tried to do it. It just came to me, it's like something I needed to get out. And I still search for food related things. Like I'm right now in the process of looking for this like mugwort rice cake filled with preserved bamboo and pork. And I've been asking all these people like around, asking community and friends, like, where can I find this? It used to be at a supermarket that I went with my mom to get. And that supermarket is no longer there. And you can find it like, there are aunties and old older women who sell this food in the streets in Taiwan, but even in Taiwan, it's not like sold in supermarkets. So something I'm probably gonna have to make if I want. But there's that
Yeah.
sense of like nostalgia related to a person who has passed, like you have mentioned, and not necessarily like
Yeah.
her food is great, and there are ways where I've recreated her foods, but there's also ways in which we've eaten foods together, which I just can't find, and it's not really her
Yeah.
creation, but it's just like a memory we shared together. So it's a way to process and I guess digest emotions and circumstances that are overpowering, and also a good way to digest foods vicariously, through the textual production. It's like I can sort of eat it as I write it.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about the story, and it doesn't really touch on the food so much, but it talks about how traditions change over time. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is how food tradition changes over time as you have the availability of ingredients and things like that. And it's something that Nibedita also touched on earlier. And there's a recipe in my family that comes from my great aunt, and it's for Lebkuchen. And this is a German traditional cookie. And Beth is nodding because I've shared the recipe with her. The original recipe calls for Hirschhorn salts. You can't find that in the States. It calls for different leaveners and things like that that just are not available commercially in the States because this was a recipe that was written in the 1940s in Germany, and it's just not there. So I've recreated the recipe myself. I use modern what I can get as leaveners, and one of the things that I decided I was not going to do anymore is it calls for citron, which is just citron peels basically, which are only available at certain times of the year in the markets here. They're commercial, they're dyed, they're terrible for you. And I went, you know what? I could use dried papaya, dried pineapple, dried kiwi. I can mash those up in my food processor and I can use those. And suddenly I have a modern recipe that tastes just as good in every respect as this old recipe from my great aunt. And is this not the axe of my grandfather that's been passed down to me? And that's some of what your story was doing with the funeral urn, which was making the tradition her own in a way, and unfolding it in a different way than maybe her mother anticipated. But it was still respectful of the tradition and the filial piety, but it also made it her own so that she could go forward into the future. And I thought that while it didn't talk about that in terms of food, it talked about that in a different way, and I thought that was lovely.
Oh, and yeah, and thank you. That's very kind of you to say. And also for fortune cookies, as you are discussing about how food transforms, it's a super interesting topic because
it
really is an American invention, and there are competing stories about the origin of fortune cookies. And one of them is that it's from Japan. And so when I was living in Japan in the past, I had an art show where I was talking about American foods or ethnic American foods. And I was showing about takeout boxes and fortune cookies. And I bought the quote unquote original fortune cookie from Kyoto. And it's like much thicker and it has like darker color and it's flavored with miso. And there's like a paper insert on the outside of the cookie rather than the inside, like between the pincers. So, the story is that for the fortune cookie, well, the supposed story is that Chinese immigrants took over the Japanese tea house businesses during internment and inherited the molds for the cookies. And the fortune cookie became this like iconic Chinese cookie. It is now with the fortune in the middle. And I find that super interesting because it's about the transformation of the cookie, which is such a symbol of this greasy Chinese food in America. But if you go to other areas in the Sinosphere, like China, the cookie is not widely known or distributed. And I even had it here recently, just, not too long ago at a Lunar New Year celebration at the local library where they're giving out fortune cookies. And I'm like, oh, I love fortune cookies. So I guess it says to me that when people migrate to other areas, they pick up other traditions and they pass these off iconically as their own, or it comes to represent like diaspora communities in new ways. And I think what would be really interesting is like how will space colonization like affect this?
Oh, yes.
We have such a dearth of ingredients out there. They might
They
make
actually have the story sitting at Tails and Feathers for 90 some odd days, which involves my family's Lebkuchen recipe and how he would basically do this on a colony ship, because the first thing that would go would be the store of spices. The second thing that would go would be the store of almonds, because you don't have trees anymore. You might have peanuts as legumes that you could use instead. So I have one generation making it with artificial spices. I have the next generation making it instead with tulip bulbs, because tulip bulbs are actually edible. They were a subsistence thing in Holland during World War II. You have to remove a kernel from the middle of them, because that's sort of toxic and bad for the tummy. But the bulb itself is actually supposed to be very nutty in flavor, things like that. And so we go all the way through the colonization, all the way to another world, and then they're able to grow the foods again, having taken them out of storage and everything like that. And then they're going, it's not quite the way you've made it, Grandma. It's nice, this traditional recipe, but it's not the one that I grew up with, so it's not the right way. So yeah, I'm hoping that one sells at some point.
Oh, I hope to read it.
Let's skip back up to Beth. When your second story, which is how to creatively host cheese parties during and after the apocalypse, which appeared in Hexagon magazine, issue 10, fall 2022. In this flash piece, the type of apocalypse matters. If you're going out fast, host your cheese party with abandon. If you face a slower demise, conduct cheese triage, eating the high moisture cheeses before the lack of power for refrigeration ruins them. Hard cheeses can be crammed into your go bag like all of your other survival gear. Choose your guests wisely for their survival potential. So this actually just struck me as being fascinating, because foods that we consider very fancy today, all these exotic cheeses, were originally subsistence foods. They were designed to stay in a cave for months or years at a time. It was a way of storing energy and nutrients over time. But so the assumption that we have that fancy cheese is this classist thing is really not true. And you return them to being the subsistence food in the apocalypse. So was that your intention in writing the story? Or did you have something else in mind?
That definitely played into it, because you think of, it's amazing if you read into food history, and it's a really neat topic. Paul Kinsett has a really cool book on this. He's like, I think, out of Vermont, and a big food historian into cheese. But you read back and you have like early records going into, the Middle East thousands of years ago to soldiers' cheese. And that was, part of the payment. Ancient Rome, cheese from there went all over the Roman world. And Alpine cheese, which most people don't realize, is massive. You're talking about 80-pound wheels of cheese that are like the size of a car wheel. And that traveled all over the Roman world from, years ago. And even into the 1600s, you had cheese piracy, where you had early versions of, of wax-covered cheeses from Northern Europe would be stolen by pirates and would be sold overseas. I mean, it's just, there's this incredibly complex history. And then you have fresh cheeses, just the kind that you can make in a day using, add in something to coagulate the milk, shake it up, press it, you have your cheese to eat with dinner, and that's it. You don't have left. So there's this whole range, and you have to think, just for modern day, if the electricity goes out, what are you going to eat first? And you look to history, and you look to modern bacterial knowledge, and that's how you prioritize things. Whatever's in your fridge, whatever's in your cupboard, that's the order you go through. And and I focused on cheese because that's my thing.
Living in a hurricane-prone area, I understand food triage all too well. I really enjoyed the story. It's not the first time that I've read it, but reading it through the eyes of the podcast for this episode was just really intriguing. We're going to move to Amelia. No, I'm not going to move to Amelia. Now I'm going to ask you, Beth, would you mind talking about that poem? Because I don't remember the title of it off the top of my head.
My cat, he. And it's words, my cat, comma, he. Because that's a refrain throughout the poem, using, my cat, he. But that's about eating disorders, and it has a main character who is starving themselves, and the thing that saves them, the thing that keeps them living, the thing that inspires them through great effort to eat again is the love and the support of their cat.
Yeah.
And it's a poem that it was published in Uncanny magazine. So if you go on to Google and put in "my cat he" and Uncanny, it'll come up, and it's also linked on my my website in my short works bibliography. And yeah, it was a very deeply personal poem to write.
Yeah.
It's not a topic. I've had a couple of flash stories that also go into eating disorders and toxic dieting and things like that. But that poem, I think, just it was a deeply personal one. So you were very right when you called me out and were like, "Hey, are you okay?" And yeah.
Yeah, I had to, because I read it. I think I was reading it for I think it was reading it for the Rieslings. And
Mm-hmm.
when I went through your packet, I just went, I think I have to talk to Beth. But yeah, I'm pleased that you are at a better place in your life, but it's an important topic to be aware of when you're writing food, because there are so many people for whom food is triggering. And
And it's
yeah.
been triggering for me, honestly, because I have a food blog called Ready or Not. Every Wednesday I post a new recipe on my site. I've been doing it over 10 years. And I share a lot of the things that I bake and all that. And it absolutely drives me nuts when every so often I get a comment on there going, "Oh, how do you stay so skinny when you're baking stuff like this?" And yeah, and I know a lot of you can, I mean, it's almost like a microaggression for women, where everything comes down to
Yeah.
food consumption, how we look, how that's
Yeah.
perceived. And
Yeah.
someday I think I'm going to see one of those comments. I'm just going to snap in my reply, and I'm going to lose all tact. But it really bothers me, because I don't think my weight, and I don't think any person on the internet's weight, unless they bring it up, it should never be the topic of discussion. It's just, to me, that's just good manners. It just shouldn't come up. But
Yeah.
at the same time, we shouldn't lose the enjoyment of food and be able to share that with other people, because that's so important. That's part of the
Agreed.
love of it. And I
Yeah.
hate that there are probably a lot of other people who don't share that because they are afraid of those comments. Because maybe they're skinny, maybe they're what is deemed overweight, and they don't want those kind of snide comments either, because I've had to put up with that in the past too. And that is incredibly damaging.
It really is. Would anyone else like to chime in on this topic? Because I saw some nods in the background, but if nobody else wants to talk.
I mean, yeah, I think we can, like, something we all hear too often is you're trying to, like, enjoy food as this social thing, this sensory thing, and that it's always, like, brought down by this, "Oh, but your body is too big or too small to enjoy food in that way." And it's,
Yeah.
I mean, just the fact that both are kind of weaponized means it's nonsense. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Amelia, since you spoke up, I'm going to move to you next, and I'm going to talk about your poem, The Lure Courses, from Zoetic Press's Heathentide Orphans collection. This is a weird, in the best possible sense of the word, and resonant poem positing a post-apocalyptic world where the narrator's dog debones invisible chickens for broth that the human is allowed to share. The recipes in the poem usually include the dog as a source of comfort, whether cuddled up under a blanket or allowing the dog to lick your face. But the final course has no dog, just the image of hiding your own bones unshared behind the lead-sealed door of a fallout shelter. The world did not end with bombs. Food as a source of comfort is something we've talked about, and at least in passing. We've talked about food as love, but not as comfort so far. Here it's an absence of food throughout the poem that really marks it. The chicken is invisible, and the recipes don't involve food; they involve blankets or sheets or the other luxury items. So people are still seeking comfort of all sorts. What can be found in this lost and betrayed world? Is there any particular message you wanted the audience to derive from this poem, or have I caught it?
Actually, I think Beth covered this just a while ago. It's that kind of dogs are better people than people in a lot of ways. This is, I mean, for all it talks about hunger and it's written in the form of recipes. I guess this is like looking back at it, more a poem about dogs and
It is.
the kind of unconditional love of a dog for a narrator who's not a bad person, not a good person, slightly cowardly, very average. And even then, this sort of animal that is with her through this whole thing for the animal's entire life in a way that she isn't necessarily there for it.
Right. We're going to move back to Nibedita for Never Yawn Under a Banyan Tree, which appeared in Anathema magazine in 2017. Link will be in the comments. First of all, I want to say how much I loved this story. It has such a strong and powerful voice and so much humor in it, and yet at the same time, it has so much to say. Meena is a 20-something Bengali academic who prefers girls and food to boys and marriage. Not that her mother knows that. And on a date set up by her mother, which she agreed to more for the food than for the company, Meena accidentally inhales a pret, a ghost, who shares her delight in food but really just wants his banyan tree outside the restaurant not to be cut down. Meena tries everything, including turning to Rusha, a newspaper art editor of her acquaintance, who makes her heart go pitter-pat, trying to save the banyan tree from being cut down by the restaurant owner. But in the end, it's turning to her online food blog followers that saves the day. The ghost finally leaves her on a burp, and his final message to her is to ask Rupsha out to dinner. And it's extended exactly that way in the text. The story is characterized by lighthearted good humor and fabulous food descriptions. I'm really glad that I ate before I read it. What was the inspiration for this story, and what do you want people to take away from it?
First off, since you mentioned the ghost final words, the story was reprinted and podcast in Podcastle, where SB Divya narrates it, and they just nail the querulous old man with a Bengali accent voice for the ghost. They just nail it. So I would super recommend listening to that if you feel like laughing here. So yes, but yeah, the story was, as I mentioned earlier, just a love letter to all the food I was at that point. I think this is my first publication. I moved to the USA like a year ago. I was in this little college town in Illinois, missing home, missing all the food from home. And I think at that time, very recently just come out as bisexual. So I needed a story where the protagonist's wants and appetites were an uncomplicated source of joy, more or less. It is maybe not very realistic as a story in the sense of how this character can do the thing she does and get away with it without being without facing homophobia or various other kinds of isms of society. But we need stories like that too sometimes, and I think I needed that story right then, where this person can be herself and find joy in what she wants and what her appetites are in many senses of the word.
I love that. It is such a joyous story, and I enjoyed every moment I spent reading it, and I thank you for sharing it. Finally, we're going to turn back to Xiaolin, and we're going to talk about one of the longest titles I've ever seen in my life, which is the Gulp Review for Jackal Beer, Burgers, and More at the Intergalactic Highway Rest Stop number 698309 and the Dragon Fruit Nebula, which appeared in in Galaxy's Edge. This flash piece spoofs Yelp reviews of dubious quality to include the fact that Yelp reviewers often become recursive, with one reviewer commenting on another's review and then another. This piece is light and amusing and deals with wholly imaginary foods that are not quite alive enough, or include chickleberries, which run away from the consumer to the delight or the frustration of the species in response. What was the inspiration for this story specifically, and what do you want people to take away from it?
I think you nailed it with the Yelp reviews. I mean, there's all kinds of reviews. I was reading a lot of reviews in Japan and Japanese and Chinese and other languages when I lived in countries, just to check out quote unquote restaurants and virtually check out restaurants. And yeah, I think it's I just find the reviews very interesting.
Yes.
And there's another aspect, which is the biological and physiological
Oh, yes.
intake of food. And with aliens, we don't know how they will take in nourishment. And is it through a mouth? Is it through some other orifice? Is it not? Is it just touch? We don't know. And so even
Yeah.
with humans, food appreciation is so subjective. Food
Mhm.
preferences, restrictions, allergies, aversions, and there's genetic differences in tasting, like cilantro
Mhm.
or mushroom textures, or
Yes.
the things that trigger people. I'm sure, with a rotation of intergalactic species eating your food, if you're cooking it, you would get an array of varying reviews from these clientele. And so I think food culture also includes the landscape surrounding food, not just food itself. So that's food
Mhm.
reviews. We've talked about Food Network, like Patty talked about
Mhm.
Food Network. And so you have this whole world surrounding these foods, and you have and there's also the ambience, the service, the presentations on food and social media, which I
Yes.
think is also maybe a kind of compulsion in itself, but maybe a
Yeah.
societal compulsion to document every garnish that you have on your plate in a beautiful way, which leads to problems such as ugly foods being thrown out, and other
Yeah.
societal food problems. Yeah, and so even the state of the bathroom is part of the gulp review story.
Yeah.
and,
Exactly.
and and it all affects our enjoyment and consumption of the food. And so, like you said, there's also the recursive element, referencing other
Mhm.
reviews and themselves as well. So it becomes its own little world, its own little strange little gustatory
Exactly.
literature.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's so
Which is very true to Yelp reviews, because very often I'll be sitting there trying to decide, do I want to try this place or not? And I'm reading the reviews and I'm sitting there going, they're often their own little space, and I don't know that this actually has any relevance to me, but
because you have
I'm just gonna have to go there and just chance it and try it for myself.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think the reviews, it boils down to a number, 4 or 5 stars, but then it's oh, I
Hmm.
love the food, but the service was so slow. Well, how does that boil to a number? It's a
Yeah.
a very fascinating sort of phenomenon where you take these very subjective things and you mash it together to make this number that you can then average out among many people,
Yeah.
or
And
maybe non-people in this case.
non-people. Yeah. All right, we're going to move to other people's work now. This is on Shining Moon. We like to lift up other people too. And the story that we've selected for this week is Bone Soup by Eugenia Triantafylio. I'm completely mangled for a very Greek last name. I apologize for that. Strange Horizons, July 2022. The link will be in the comments, so you can find it even though I mangled the name. Dina's grandmother has always made sugary sweets for Dina's friends growing up, but for Dina herself, no such thing. You are a girl for the meat, she's told over and over, and is encouraged to eat the body parts of the animal that will help her grow stronger ones of her own. Break a bone? Eat bone broth. Upset stomach? Eat tripe. Dina resists this until college, when she finally asks for her grandmother's monkey brains to help her study for an intense exam. No one else's recipe works the way her grandmother's does. We come at the realization gradually, almost sideways, that the grandmother has been stealing and replacing body parts from other people to feed her family up, replacing an ear with a whorl of cinnamon pastry, for example, and feeding that body part that she's stolen to Dina to improve her. We get confirmation of this when the grandmother suffers a heart attack and Dina turns to her recipe book and her best friend to heal her grandmother's heart. This is a dark, dark story that comes at its content very much from the side, but is hugely effective. What did we like about this story? How did it celebrate or subvert food and foodways? Let's talk about this. And I'm going to start at the bottom with Xiaolin.
Yeah, it's very haunting and spooky. I think that's a love and oh wow, a powerful punch. And I think what's also surprising is, as I'm reading the story, the food sounds so delicious. I think that, I think that's also why at the end, as you get, is the creepiness kind of comes.
Yeah.
You get that feeling oh man, this sounded so good. What does that say about me as the consumer?
Exactly. You are implicated.
Yeah.
Nibedita, what did you like or dislike about this story?
Oh, I adored this. This is completely my jam. Like I mentioned, the two stories I mentioned to put forward for this podcast are something of an exception to the larger body of my work in that they are relatively positive, while my work overall tends to lean dark fantasy horror, lots of cannibalism and less savory appetites. And so this story is like absolutely catnip to me because it deals with hunger in multiple senses of the word. And appetites, once again, in appetites that are more than just the strictly nutrition or food-based appetites, and just like the darker side of hunger and appetite and what it leads us to do, especially when the hunger is for love or family.
Absolutely. And again, the grandmother is cooking out of love. Her food is love. Again, it's just a dark and twisted love. It's lovely. It's wonderful. It's really, really creepy. Amelia, how about you? What did you like or dislike about the story?
Yeah, I liked, in the same vein as everyone else, the whiplash of going back and forth between this wholesome love and this exploitation of other people and like total disregard for them. Even to sort of expand on what Xiaolin said is, you read about this food and you want to eat it. What does that say about you? You read about this kind of love and you're like, oh, that makes me miss my grandmother or something.
Yeah.
Then you're like, what does that say about me? That even this kind of love sounds very warm and appealing at the same time that it's tragic and dangerous.
Yeah. Patty, how about you? What did you find in this story of interest?
Well, I'd read this one before, and I was happy to read it again because I love Eugenia's work, and I love this story. I especially I just love this character of the grandmother. Like, just the fact that she will put her family, excuse me, first at all costs. Is amazing. And I love the contrast too of everyone else in the village or whatever who just sees her as like this sweet old lady who everybody loves, and she's always got candy for the kids and whatever, and you never know what's behind the sweetness, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
When I was rereading it, because I read it the first time for my notes, and then I went back and I was rereading it before the podcast yesterday, and I was looking through it. I was like, oh, look at all the places where she foreshadowed it, and I didn't see it the first time through, where people came out of her kitchen looking light and a little dazed, and I was like, oh shoot, I completely missed that the first time. Dummy me.
Right.
Beth, how about you? What did you like or dislike?
You have to love a Baba Yaga type character, and however it's reinterpreted across cultures, there's just something fascinating about that. But I love this version even more than the stereotypical Baba Yaga, because Baba Yaga was just made up to be such a stereotype of this ugly old woman who does magic and tricks you. And and like the other just said, the fact that this is a grandmother, it's out of love. It's and she's not even being cruel to the people she's harvesting from necessarily. It's all the same. And one of the things I really liked about this story, and a way that it very successfully developed suspense, was in the repetition of the body parts. Meat for meat, brain for brain. And you have all of these ingredients that are being repeated like this, and it ends up having this poetic, almost meditational quality to it as you go through the story, that otherwise it reads like, I would say, a normal story. It doesn't come across as heavily poetic or anything like that. But then the way those verses kind of come through with the anatomy, it's mesmerizing.
And then that last one lands. Yes. And it lands hard.
Because it escalates body part by body part in a way that it takes you a couple of them to realize that there is the repetition. Like, oh, this is interesting. And then, and then that ending nails it.
Yeah, it really does. Yes.
I found it also interesting because I think in Chinese culture there is this idea too that if you eat like the fish's eye, it'll help with your eyesight. So I think it resonates in multiple cultures and communities. Yeah. And I think I also when I mentioned earlier about like food constituting the self and you take it in, this really takes that to another level, and also separates a boundary between a self, like a family as part of yourself, so you can take other
Yeah.
people's stuff and put it into yourself, but not bounded by you, but bounded by your family. And like, so the separation between yourself and other people is very apparent here because the other people are not part of this family system, which I think
Yeah.
you've kind of mentioned.
Yeah. That's really, really dark. And Amelia, you look like you're raising your hand too.
Yeah. Actually, I made a little note kind of about almost the opposite thing, that this story is like personal bond over biological family, because we see both with the grandmother and her son, they were sort of the chosen children, and I got the implication that throughout life there had been some harvesting from even their siblings to prioritize
Ooh.
the right child, or the most
Yeah.
beloved child in a way that
Yeah. I had the definite impression that the on the granddaughter tier, that she was the chosen child, that she was the one who was being, no, you are for meat. The other children get the sweetmeats.
yeah,
And
and
so
I think that also her father and her grandmother
possibly, yeah.
were the same kind of chosen children.
Interesting. All right, we're going to shift gears here. We're going to talk about what you all have coming out now or coming out soon. So I'm going to start with Xiaolin. What do you have coming out soon that you want to talk about, or that's come out recently?
Yeah, I have a story in Clark's World. It's called Nine Beauties and the Entangled Threads. And the story includes, in addition to food of lots of Japanese candies that are in there, there's also whips, forests, and and lots of crops of some sort. So the whips are also something I teach martial arts, so I have crafted whips, so it's something of interest to me as well. So I was very happy to see it in print, and I hope you can all enjoy it and read it.
Nice, thank you. That's out now or coming out soon?
It's out. It's in the March issue, so it's out right now.
Nice. All right, I will look for that and see if I can drop that in the links. Nibedita, how about you? Out recently or coming out soon?
I had something out recently. I had a story out in the January issue of Sunday Morning Transport. If you just Google my name and Sunday Morning Transport, or go to my website, it's linked on there. It's free to read online. It's called Agni, Agni, which is the Sanskrit and Hindu word for fire, Hindi word for fire, and it is about anger.
Interesting. All right. Moving up my list to Amelia, coming out soon or out recently? What you got?
My most recent published piece was a poem in Spectral Realms 20. It's a long form narrative poem about a baker hired to cater the wedding of a very Pan-like figure, and how that goes for them.
Oh, I remember this one.
Yeah.
Oh, I liked that one. Yeah, that's gonna be fun to see it again.
It has hedgehogs in it too, so
I have to check my mailbox and see if that's there. Patty, how about you? Out recently or coming out soon that you want to talk about?
Very soon. I'm actually going to, like the story we were talking about of mine on this podcast episode, how to impress a top food critic and put your restaurant on the galactic map. I can't even say my own title. That one's going to be reprinted very soon in the spring Dragon Gems anthology. So that'll probably be my next thing. And then after that, I also have a story coming out in Lightspeed called The Life You've Given Me, Rusty, which is kind of about the relationship of a robot and a boy, and there's some dark stuff in there too.
Patty's story, it has to have dark stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I have coming out next, and I have some cool news that I'm not yet allowed to share, so stay tuned for that, but I'm looking forward to sharing that very soon too. So
okay, well, I will look forward to hearing that then. Beth, how about you? Coming out soon or out recently?
Well, I just recently had the second book of my current duology came out, finished up the series. So first book is 1,000 Recipes for Revenge. And the second one that came out in January is A Feast for Starving Stone. And it is think of musketeers, daring do, and food magic all together, and they're out from 47 North. Any bookstore can get hold of them. They're in a print, ebook, and also I'm very excited to say audiobook, which I just love that it's out there in audiobook, because I always had people want that for my past series, and now it is out there. So yeah,
Fantastic.
go for those.
All right. Thank you all so very much for your time. Did I miss anybody?
Yourself?
Yourself.
Oh, me. No, I don't talk about me. This is to lift up other people. Let's thank you all very much for your time. I enjoyed talking with all of you. Next week on Shining Moon, we'll be shifting gears to talk about writing media tie-ins with Marie Brennan, Kate Hartsfield, and Caitlin J. Starling. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons if such things happen to be around for you to hit. And we'll see you all then. And we are